Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West. Episode 53, Bourbon on the Rocks. I'll be honest, I initially did not intend to write this episode, which, as you'll see, will not be very Burgundian-centric. But as I was working on the last episode, I kept finding myself falling into rabbit holes with what's been going on at the French court in this period. And honestly, there's just a lot going on, and it's pretty important stuff. So I figured that a digression was warranted. And thank you to David Montgomery from the Siècle podcast for graciously allowing me to yoink this episode name, because as we'll see, the Duke of Bourbon is up to no good. So to set the stage, in 1435, Jean Louvet, a former favorite of Charles VII, and the mastermind behind the murder of John the Fearless, penned a letter to the Duke of Savoy where he outlined the state of the French court. Louvet had been out of power and away from court for a decade by this point, but he still understood the mind of the king, and was still able to perceive the goings-on at court even from afar. Louvet began his letter by noting that at this point, quote, "The king had no particular servant who has more influence on him than the others." Now, this was actually somewhat of a novel development, as for most of his life thus far, Charles had been dominated by a succession of favorites. Louvet himself was once one of these men, and until recently, Georges de la Tremoille had held sway over the king. However, in 1433, de la Tremoille had been ousted by an alliance between the houses of Anjou and Brittany, and this ouster had put an end to Charles VII's days of domination by one man. But even though Charles VII was no longer dominated by any single counselor, he still had his favorites, and according to Louvet, the king's closest counselors were now Yolande of Aragon, the Dowager Duchess of Anjou, Charles of Anjou, the Count of Maine, and the Bastard of Orleans. As a side note, in 1439, the Bastard was made the Count of Dunois, so to keep myself from overusing the word bastard in this episode, I'll also be referring to him as John of Dunois or the Count of Dunois. On a personal level, Charles VII was closest to John of Dunois, but the Bastard disliked court intrigue, and so generally dedicated himself to war rather than politics. Therefore, political influence tended to be concentrated in the mother-son duo of Yolande of Aragon and Charles of Anjou, and for good reason. Charles VII was married to an Angevin, Marie of Anjou, and had been raised at the Angevin court rather than the royal court. Yolande of Aragon was more of a mother to the king than his own had been, and how many times have I said that this podcast, and he grew up alongside Charles of Anjou. Moreover, many of the members of his household and his court officers had cut their teeth in Angevin service. Not only were the Angevins close to the king personally, but they were deeply embedded in the court politically. Louvet also noted that Maine and Dunois had formed an alliance at court, and that each would back the projects of the other. This alliance would be tested over the coming years, but it was strong and resilient, although not immune to the occasional crack. Louvet then went on to write about the other players at court. The Breton faction was another major center of power. It was led by John V of Brittany and his brother Arthur de Richemont, the Constable of France. The houses of Anjou and Brittany had long worked together at the court of Charles VII, but their aims were not always aligned. Brittany's influence was also weakened by the fact that Duke John V of Brittany was technically still an English ally, albeit a fairly reluctant and uncooperative one. But this did mean that John V was rarely present at court, and that Brittany's resources could not be marshaled against England. Therefore, Arthur de Richemont led the faction on the ground, but like Dunois, Richemont tended to keep to the military side of things. This is less due to a personal distaste for politics, as Richemont himself had tried to dominate Charles VII throughout the mid-1420s, but rather due to the fact that the king was not a huge fan of Richemont on a personal level from all those years of attempted domination. Richemont had played with fire and gotten burned, and so he stuck to war where he was only ever in physical danger. Richemont was also the brother-in-law of Philip the Good, and so he was a helpful voice advocating against open hostilities with Burgundy. However, he did not do much to stand in the way of Charles's policy of provocation and harassment. Philip did have a more active supporter in his other brother-in-law at the court of Charles VII, the Duke of Bourbon. Bourbon was much more pro-Burgundian in outlook, but he also had less influence at court. Louvet wrote that, quote, "The principal aim of Bourbon is that my lord of Burgundy should come back to the king, and that then they could both do everything, and gather up all the others." Louvet made this remark prior to the Congress of Arras, and the events of the Congress seem to have confirmed his observation. Bourbon led the French delegation at Arras, and upon his return to court, many in the king's circle thought that Bourbon had been overly generous to Burgundy in order to gain his brother-in-law's support for his own schemes. Unfortunately for the Duke of Bourbon, this policy of supporting Burgundy did not end up yielding much for him. In the years after Arras, his influence at court only declined further, and a good deal of distance remained between Burgundy and the French court, which meant that Philip was unable to help much. However, the Duke of Bourbon did have other means of gaining influence, and the most notable of these was his connections to the Écocheurs. If you don't remember from last episode, the Écocheurs were mercenaries who were now out of work after the signing of the Treaty of Arras. Occasionally, these mercenaries would find employment in Charles VII's various campaigns against the English, but for the most part they simply continued doing what they had been doing, raiding the countryside. However, now they were beholden to no one apart from their captain. And many of these captains had ties to the House of Bourbon. Rodrigo de Viandrando, one of the most infamous and powerful, was married to an illegitimate sister of the Duke of Bourbon. Two of the Duke's illegitimate brothers were also major Écocheur captains, and also of note were the brothers Antoine and Jacques de Chabannes, who both began their careers in service of the House of Bourbon. Many of the Écocheurs came from southwest France, and so were also connected to the various Gascon factions. The three most notable of these factions were the ones centered around the houses of Foix, Armagnac, and Albret, but now I fear that I'm in danger of veering off into just listing names from here on out, so rather than just outline every faction at court, I'd like to take a moment to explore what exactly a faction was in 15th century France. It's important to note that these factions were nothing like modern political parties. Instead, they were more akin to loose networks of patronage built on personal ties. We are in the Middle Ages, after all. At the center was usually a prince or princely family, but occasionally an especially influential counselor could build up their own affinity. This affinity then spread in two directions, outwards through personal links between the other major players at court, and downwards towards their clients. Great lords would bring followers to court to try and secure positions and pensions from the crown, which could both reward those followers for good service, and ensure that the lords had allies in important positions. You might also remember Philip the Bold's extensive use of fiefrance, or in modern terms, naked bribery, to build up support by paying courtiers directly. This method of securing followers and allies was used by basically all of the players at court, and was not necessarily seen as scandalous. The term fief-rent kind of explains it away. It brought the receiver into the feudal network of the grantor. The only real difference here is that the fief was the rent in and of itself, rather than the rent coming from a piece of land. Malcolm Vail writes, quote, "Men bound by no local ties to a great magnate could thus serve their interests. Paid clients, in no way equal to those who paid them, keeping the latter, quote, in the good grace and love of my sovereign lord the king, and of my said lord the Dauphin. During periods in which the great lord was absent from court, their presence was vital. As an intelligence service alone, the courtier allies were perhaps worth their pensions and annuities." So maybe faction isn't quite the right word so much as following or affinity. It was a system defined by personal bonds, and likewise the leaders of these affinities often formed alliances and rivalries. I already mentioned the alliance between Charles of Anjou and John of Dunois, and going the other way, the Duke of Bourbon seemed to have a particular dislike of the Angevin prince. This dislike was in part personal, but also in part because he saw his influence at court falling as the influence of the Angevins continued to rise. The key event here seems to have been a court revolution in the summer of 1436, which we know of mainly because Jean Louvet wrote another letter to the Duke of Savoy in its aftermath. In the time between the two letters, it seemed that Bourbon had become the head of an anti-Angevin faction at court, and that over the course of late 1435 and early 1436, the two factions vied for power. However, all of a sudden, the bastard of Orleans was mysteriously summoned to court, and a number of influential court officials with ties to Bourbon were dismissed, and courtiers reared in Anjou replaced them. We don't really know much else about this episode, apart from the fact that Bourbon was now on the outs. But he was a man of action, and in 1437 he decided to launch a scheme to oust the Angevins and reassert his place of prominence at court. Now I have to admit that I've read several different descriptions of this plot, and for the life of me I still don't really understand it. At this point, I've come to the conclusion that the plot itself was just a bit convoluted and ill-conceived. But if anyone out there truly understands this plot and can convince me that it was actually well thought out, I'll happily issue a correction. It seems that this was a plan in two parts, and that each part centered around a different collection of princes with different aims, which for convenience I'll term the peace plot and the war plot. The war plot centered around Bourbon and the Duke of Alencon. Both of these princes were primarily motivated by a combination of personal ambition and dislike of the Angevins. The war plot was in essence a military coup to oust the Angevins. Bourbon planned on using his connections to the Ecoshore captains to rally an army in opposition to the court of Charles VII, while Alencon and the other plotters would use the military threat to force the king to dismiss his Angevin councillors and elevate other men with ties to the plotters. On the other hand, the peace plot centered around the Dukes of Brittany and Orleans. These princes didn't really hold a specific dislike for the Angevins, but they both wanted peace with England, and saw the Angevins as standing in the way of that. Remember, in 1437, Orleans is still an English prisoner, and Brittany's position between England and France made it vulnerable whenever the fighting got intense. The peace plot basically involved Brittany and Orleans trying to organize a peace conference behind Charles VII's back, and then forcing him to attend that conference. The two plots came together in the hopes of the war plotters that Orleans could become the leader of a reinvigorated anti-Angevin faction, and in the hopes of the peace plotters that once the Angevins were ousted, a more peace-oriented faction would come to power at court. And both plots seem to have underestimated the king's determination to continue the war and to keep his counselors. In any event, Charles VII was able to get ahead of the situation. Preparations for the peace conference began, while Rodrigo de Villandrando began preparing to rise up on behalf of the Duke of Bourbon. But the king learned of the plot, and was able to gather the royal army before Villandrando was ready. The Ecoshore captain simply fled the kingdom, while Charles VII decided to unleash his army against the Duke of Bourbon. After a triumphant march through the Bourbonnais, Charles VII was able to force Charles of Bourbon's submission. In the aftermath of the war plot falling apart, the peace plot floundered as well. Now that Charles VII was in charge of the situation rather than the Duke's, he demanded that the negotiations be based on his terms, which ended up being objected to by the English. Furthermore, through his participation in the plot, the Duke of Brittany's perceived neutrality was damaged, and his ability to moderate a peace conference was brought into doubt. Now, at the risk of confusing things even more, it is unclear to what extent this scheme was a plot specifically against the Angevin faction, versus a plot to limit the power of the king himself. The line between the Angevin faction and, for lack of a better term, the royal faction was somewhere between blurry and non-existent at this point. And while the rhetoric of the plotters was directed specifically against the Angevins, their actions suggest that maybe they were becoming concerned with the growing power of the king. In the years since the Treaty of Arras had been signed, the royal government had begun to hew a more independent line. The war was going well, and tax revenue was increasing. As royal fortunes continued to recover, a growing skepticism about the place of the princes in the royal government emerged as well. Charles VII knew well the danger of overmighty princes, as the memory of the ravages of the war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians was never far from his mind. So as the 1430s wore on, whenever he could, he tried to roll back princely power. Bourbon's 1437 attempted coup can be seen as a reaction to this. Rather than a conflict of one princely faction against the other, it can be seen as one of a wider collection of princes against a narrower one, dominated by the House of Anjou, yes, but also by a collection of officials and courtiers determined to increase royal power. After the king had put a stop to Bourbon's plot, the duke was accepted back into royal favor, but only once he had made a sufficiently compliant plea for mercy. Bourbon learned no lessons from the failure of the 1437 plot, and while he may have been content to return to court initially, none of the reasons for his scheming had gone away. The royal court continued to build up its power, and he continued to be excluded from the inner circle of the king. These trends only grew stronger in 1438 and 1439, when we see the king issuing a series of ordinances and edicts dedicated to reining in the magnates and securing royal control over the army. Charles VII revoked all grants made from the royal domain in the past 20 years, forbade the great lords from collecting taxes meant to fund the army, and prevented the great lords from raising their own private armies. Malcolm Vail writes, quote, "Behind the problem of the disaffected magnate, therefore, lay the question of military reform. Until the hold of the magnates on certain companies of the king's army could be broken, there was little hope of a solution to the problem of disorder. It was, again, all too easy for a great lord such as Bourbon to recruit military support for his treasonable designs. Military reform had become essential by 1439, not only to end the war with the English, but to deprive the potentially rebellious magnate of the means of revolt." But ironically, it seems that this military reform, more than anything else, was the catalyst for another noble revolt. It should not be much of a surprise that the Duke of Bourbon soon returned to plotting, and at the center of this plot once more were the Ecocheurs. Rodrigo de Viandrando, the Chaban brothers, and the bastards of Bourbon were not only Ecocheur commanders, they were clients and members of the House of Bourbon, and a key element of the Duke's power base. To allow the king's military reforms to be implemented would drastically weaken Bourbon's position in the kingdom, and that of his allies. By late 1439, Bourbon had fallen back in with his old conspiratorial ally, the Duke of Alencon. The dukes also managed to suborn the Counts of Dunois and Vendôme, the Marshal Lafayette, and Georges de la Tremoille. Vendôme and Lafayette were longtime allies of Bourbon. De la Tremoille's participation in the conspiracy came from his desire to return to power, and Dunois was convinced to join by the promise that securing the freedom of his brother Orléans would be a top priority once the king's counselors had been replaced. As the conspiracy came together, none other than the Dauphin was reeled into the plot. So let's take a moment to get introduced to Dauphin Louis. The future Louis XI was born in 1423, shortly before the disastrous Battle of Crevant. His early years were defined by French weakness and a threadbare household, but even after his father's fortunes began to recover, the prince remained isolated from court until after the fall of de la Tremoille in 1433. Louis's first experience of public life came when he was 13 years old, when he was married to Margaret of Scotland. This marriage was meant to secure his father's alliance with Scotland, as well as a possible Scottish army. The wedding itself was a clear indication of Charles's neglect of his son. The king rode into the ceremony minutes before it began, and then left right as it finished. He didn't even bother to take off his riding clothes or remove his spurs. Moreover, the Scots who accompanied Margaret to France were rushed out after the ceremony, as the king did not want to pay for their stay. As Louis entered his teens, he yearned for a role at court, but Charles VII seemed hesitant to involve his son. In 1437, he tasted battle for the first time, when he took part in an operation to take the town of Château-Landon, and a year later he joined his father on an expedition against the town of Montereau. But after that, the prince found himself with little to do. Finally, in 1439, the Dauphin was granted some independent authority when he was made the king's lieutenant general in Languedoc, and tasked with ridding the region of the Écossures. This task was made quite difficult by the fact that Louis was not provided with the money or men to make that happen, and by the fact that royal authority in Languedoc was limited at best. Still though, Louis threw himself into the task enthusiastically. He won over the local magnates, gained monetary assistance from the estates and towns of Languedoc, and energetically reformed the royal administration in the region. Over the course of the year, Louis gained the support and funds necessary to pay off and see off the Écossures, but he was called back to court before he could finish his task. Louis returned to his father's court disgruntled. The energetic prince wanted something to do, but he was mostly just kept around. What the Dauphin wanted most, however, was the Dauphiné. The territory which made the Dauphin was still in his father's hands, and despite his constant pleading, the king would not part with it. So with the Dauphin just mulling around court annoyed, it should not be much of a surprise that the Dukes of Bourbon and Alencon managed to lure him into their plot. They painted him a picture of a do-nothing court and promised reforms which would re-energize the administration, strengthen the kingdom and the crown, and put a decisive end to the 100 Years' War. Louis was won over. If their plot succeeded, the Angevin ministers would be dismissed, and the king would be declared unfit to rule and put under the tutelage of the Dauphin. Now, it probably was left unsaid that the Dukes of Bourbon and Alençon intended to be the ones pulling the strings of the Dauphin as he pulled the strings of the king, but Louis, now 16, figured that he would be able to assert his own will. The Dauphin and Alençon were to raise an army in Poitou, while Bourbon was to rally the Écossures in Touraine and Berry. Charles VII reacted to the outbreak of the revolt, termed the Praguerie in a nod to the revolt of the Hussites in Bohemia, with uncharacteristic swiftness and determination. The king only had a small force on hand when news of the Praguerie reached him, but nevertheless he sent out summons for loyal soldiers throughout Anjou and Poitou, and immediately began marching on the rebels. The Count of Dunois promptly quit the rebellion and returned to the king, either due to cold feet or to the fact that his brother was finally in the process of securing his freedom, thus removing Dunois' primary grievance against the court. And unfortunately for the rebels, Dunois was not the only one to desert the cause. As the king marched, his military might increased as that of the rebels withered away. On his way to face down the Duke of Bourbon, Charles VII defeated a company of Écossures and was reinforced by Arthur de Richemont and a company of Breton soldiers. Bourbon, not liking his chances, then fled for the security of his own lands. With one of the figureheads dealt with for the time being, the king decided to refocus his attentions on the Duke of Alençon and the Dauphin. The king's march into Poitou was barely contested, and the Praguerie seemed to be coming apart at the seams. Like Bourbon, Alençon and the Dauphin fled in the face of the royal army, and met up with their comrade in his Duchy of Auvergne. As the rebels reconstituted in Auvergne, one of the Duke of Burgundy's two contributions to this episode can be seen when he offered to facilitate negotiations between the king and the rebels. but Charles VII refused the offer. The king knew that he was in the position of strength here, and he had no intention of allowing momentum to slip away from him. The utter failure of the Praguerie can be seen from the fact that as Charles VII moved into Auvergne, the estates of the duchy met and voted taxes to the king rather than to their rebellious duke. Moreover, as the king marched on, the Ecochures, still in league with the rebels, deserted, as more soldiers flocked to the royal army. Seeing their support melting away, Bourbon and Alencon sent envoys to the king and pleaded for mercy. At first, the rebels hoped to bargain, but the king demanded their unconditional surrender. The Dauphin resisted, but Bourbon and Alencon gave in. In the aftermath of the king's triumph, you might expect Bourbon and Alencon to have some sort of reckoning. But in fact, the royal vengeance was quite limited. Some Ecochore captains were executed, and some royal officials who had taken part in the Praguerie were banished from court, but for the most part, that was it. The king did force his son to make a humiliating submission, and he did force the rebel dukes to acknowledge that, quote, "All the war of the said kingdom belongs to the king and his officers, and to none other. And there is no one so great in the said kingdom that he can levy war, nor retain troops, without the authority, commission, and command of the king." But the implementation of the military reforms which sparked the Praguerie wouldn't really happen until the mid-1440s. Bourbon and Alencon were accepted back into court, and the Dauphin was finally granted the Dauphiné. Graham Small writes, quote, "After 1440, the restive elements among the leadership of the Westerners constituted a much reduced threat to Charles VII's authority. Indeed, the king's ability to harness and direct the energies of these men was a vital prerequisite of the Second Caroline Reconquest, just as it had been of the first. The extreme moderation of Charles's treatment of the rebels certainly helped to restore a degree of unity." While the Praguerie was by no means the final noble revolt in medieval France, it did demonstrate how much the strength of the king and his court had grown over the years. And that strength was demonstrated once again 2 years later, albeit in a different fashion. In 1442, the Dukes of Burgundy and Orléans decided to hold a summit of the leading princes of the kingdom in Nevers, ostensibly to deal with a marriage alliance between the houses of Anjou and Burgundy, but in practice it was another attempt to return to a government of the princes. In any event, the planned marriage alliance fell apart, but the summit went on as scheduled, although without the participation of the Angevins. In addition to Burgundy and Orléans, the Dukes of Alençon and Bourbon attended, as well as the Counts of Dunois, Eu, Vendôme, and Nevers. The Duke of Brittany could not attend due to illness, but he did send his oldest son, Francis, to represent his interests. Both the king and Dauphin were invited, but Charles VII attended only briefly, and the Dauphin not at all. At Nevers, the princes discussed all sorts of things related to the government of the realm, and they drew up a memorandum with numerous demands which they submitted to the king. Included here, first and foremost, was the demand, quote, "that the king should summon the princes of his blood to deal with the great affairs of the kingdom more than any other people, and it is most proper that he should do this, seeing the great interest that they have in the kingdom, and that this is what used to be done by the most Christian kings of France, his progenitors." Also of note were demands to reduce taxation, to deal with the Ecochures, to call the Estates General of France more frequently, and give it more of a role in the kingdom, and to commit to making peace with England. But as I just said, this conference was another opportunity for the king to demonstrate his strength, and he did just that when he simply ignored the demands of the princes. This was no mean feat, as the dukes and counts gathered at Nevers were some of the most powerful men in his realm, speaking as one, but the king's power and authority allowed him to stand up to them easily. So going into the 1440s, we see a more confident and a more independent king, one who knows his strength and is wary of the strength of the princes. To be frank, this is not good news for Burgundy, And as Burgundy continues to build alliances and make friends in France, the king will only grow more suspicious of him. Philip the Good wanted desperately to be welcomed back to court. He was self-consciously a French prince, he was the first peer of the realm, and he wanted to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather and namesake, Philip the Bold. But this Philip is facing a much different court than his grandfather did, and a much more hostile king. It is perhaps the great tragedy of Philip's reign that he could never quite accept that, and it is almost certainly one of his greatest blind spots. The paths of Burgundy and France are diverging, but the Duke does not want to accept it. But in part, this was the Duke's own doing, and more his attention was pulled eastwards into the Holy Roman Empire. That was where Burgundy's most fertile opportunities lay, and we will be spending a lot of time there over the coming episodes. Thank you so much to my patrons, with an extra thanks to Craig, Graf von Hoensbroek, who recently increased his pledge, and to Christine, Duchesse de Nemours, Elliot, Graf von Kravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Meursault, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Semur, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graf von Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, Olivier, Comte d'Ussert, John, Graf von Helmont, Spencer, Graf von Breda, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at ValoisBurgundy on Blue Sky, or check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at GrandDukesOfTheWest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.